Ever wondered what really happened in Chernobyl and what might still be lurking there today? In 1986, a single explosion turned a city into a ghost zone. But the real story didn't end that night. From radiation that still burns unseen to strange discoveries inside the exclusion zone. This is everything you weren't told. Let's step inside Chernobyl.
On April 26, 1986, during a routine test, the number 4 reactor at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant had a power surge and triggered an emergency shutdown. Instead of shutting down, the reactor kept surging power, and in no time at all the plant was in full disaster mode. The control rods used to manage the core's temperature were inserted too late into the process. Instead of cooling down, the rods cracked in the rising heat from the core and locked into place. As if that wasn't bad enough, the water used to cool the entire reactor vaporized, resulting in a massive explosion. The first explosion blew the 4 million pound lid of the reactor through the roof of the building. The second explosion followed shortly thereafter and sent broken core material, fire, and radioactive waste into the air. Without the tons of steel and concrete typically used to shield it, the core of the reactor began to melt. The result of the melting process is a substance called corium. Corium is a lava-like molten mixture of portions of the nuclear reactor core, nuclear fuel, fission products, and control rods. At Chernobyl, the corium melted through the bottom of the reactor vessel, oozed through pipes, ate through concrete, and eventually cooled enough to solidify. The spot where the corium solidified wouldn't be discovered until December in 1986. To contain the fallout, a large concrete enclosure named the sarcophagus was built on the site. Access points were left in the sarcophagus for researchers. During one such research trip, their equipment registered levels of radiation so high that it would kill anyone who got too close for more than a few seconds. In order to see what was causing the readings, the scientist attached a camera to a wheeled contraption and rolled it in the direction the readings were emanating. What they saw was dubbed the elephant's foot. The elephant's foot is so deadly that spending only 30 seconds near it will result in dizziness and fatigue. 2 minutes near it and your cells will begin to hemorrhage. By the time you hit the 5-minute mark, you're a goner. Even after 30 years, the foot is still melting through the concrete base of the power plant. Its existence makes the city uninhabitable to humans for at least the next 100 years. If it melts down into a source of groundwater, it could trigger another explosion or contaminate the water of nearby villages. And yet, in spite of the elephant foot's toxic presence in Chernobyl, something strange is happening. Animals are flourishing, nature is taking over. Biologists from the University of Georgia set up cameras in the Belarus evacuation zone to try and track animal activity in the area. What they found was surprising. Many different kinds of animals aren't simply living in the irradiated area, they're thriving in it. The cameras spotted gray wolves, red foxes, wild boars, moose, and deer. It's not that the area isn't still dangerous to humans, but instead, the animal life seems to have found a way to thrive in spite of it. And even more important than that, the flourishing animal life shows just how destructive the presence of human beings can be on the animal population of any given area. Whatever the reason, the area of the Chernobyl disaster has become a kind of wildlife refuge for many different species of animals. At least some small amount of good was able to come from one of the worst disasters in the last 3 decades. For more than 30 years since the disaster that took place since the Chernobyl disaster, a single version that would explain the causes of the accident was not formed. Some experts consider only station personnel guilty of a catastrophe, others write off an accident for the imperfection of the reactor design. At the moment there are several Chernobyl conspiracy theories. With official versions of the disaster began to appear and alternative explanations, based primarily on speculation. Welcome. Local earthquake. The author of this theory was an employee of the Russian Academy of Sciences E. Barkovsky. He suggests that on April 26 near the power plant, due to a shift in the tectonic rupture, a weak earthquake occurred, which caused technological disruptions in the core of the reactor. The basis for this version was a seismic shock recorded at about the time of the accident in the vicinity of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. According to supporters of this theory, the push was registered before, not during the explosion, and the strong vibration that preceded the disaster was caused not by the processes inside the reactor, but by an earthquake. Tectonic weapons. This version, in fact, is a continuation of the previous one, but assumes that the earthquake was caused not by natural causes, but by tectonic weapons. There is evidence that during the Cold War tectonic weapons were being intensively developed both in the US and in the USSR. The peculiarity of this weapon is that its use is difficult to distinguish from a conventional earthquake. A low-power nuclear charge is laid in a tectonic rift, and a nuclear explosion provokes an earthquake. UFOs. Supporters of ufology do not deny the official version of events, but make their own adjustments. According to the authors of the theory, after at 1:24 on April 26, 1986 there was an explosion at the 4th power unit. Many residents of the city saw in the sky above the station an unidentified flying object. There are also a number of photographs on which an unknown object is imprinted on the Chernobyl NPP. Also in 2013 stalker Pavel Grechka, who was walking along the roofs in the dead city Pripyat, took some unidentified objects flying over the Chernobyl nuclear power plant on his camera. Radar station Duga, Russian woodpecker. Duga, an over-the-horizon radar for an early detection system for intercontinental ballistic missile launches. The radar was installed near Chernobyl. The arc was called the Russian woodpecker for the characteristic sound, which was obtained by imposing the frequencies of the radiating antenna with the frequencies of commercial and service radio stations. The radar interrupted communications with aircraft and ships, amateur communication sessions, and also influenced telephone communications. The power supply of the arc was completely realized from the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. The station operated in the operating frequencies of the radar systems of civil aviation and the fishing fleet of European countries, 3.26-17.54 MHz. In this regard, Western countries have made claims to the USSR that the arc is potentially dangerous for aviation and maritime navigation. The radar was modernized, and since 1985, state tests have been conducted on it. CIA diversion. The author of this theory was the former Deputy Chief of Staff of the Special Zone troops who worked directly at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, Colonel V. Podsvarov. According to him, the Chernobyl disaster was the result of the work of a foreign agent. What is your thoughts on Chernobyl? From July 1976 to December 1989, a strange noise could be heard on shortwave radios all around the globe. The signal was extremely powerful and was immediately noticed by both amateur and professional radio operators. Even commercial industries and devices in people's homes were affected by the sound. The noise was a repetitive tapping noise that many believed sounded like a woodpecker or a helicopter. Although it was heard around the world and despised by many, the actual source of the noise was not confirmed until after the Soviet Union had fallen. Even today, much of the information surrounding the system remains a mystery. Although the source would not be publicly confirmed for years, those in the radio community had already concluded that the noise was produced by an over-the-horizon radar. This conclusion would prove to be correct. The source was the Duga radar, a critical part of the Soviet Union's early warning system to detect incoming missiles. The antenna of the Duga radar was huge, 700 meters long and 150 meters high. Despite the size, the Soviets built two one near the now abandoned town of Chernobyl, which was called Duga 1, and another in Siberia, called Duga 2. The radars were protected by their own air defense systems to ensure their survival during a conflict. The Chernobyl antenna was pointed north towards the United States, who they believed was the most likely to launch intercontinental ballistic missiles at them. Meanwhile, Duga 2 in Siberia guarded against missiles coming from the east. China and Japan were growing economies at the time, and their military capabilities were growing too, which was a cause for concern for the USSR. Duga 2 could also detect U.S. missiles coming from the Pacific Ocean. The sound heard on shortwave radios was a distinctive tapping noise, earning it the name, Russian woodpecker. Each site had a transmitter and receiver, located about 40 miles apart. As a conventional radar can only see as far as the horizon, the Duga radar circumvented this problem by bouncing its signal off the ionosphere, enabling it to see over the horizon. To do this, an enormously powerful transmitter is required. The Duga system was able to transmit at 10 megawatts of power. The goal of the system was to detect an attack within the first 2 or 3 minutes after a missile had been launched. The Soviets had been experimenting with early warning radars for a while before the Duga system was put into action. The first prototype system was named Duga, meaning arc, a name that would be carried over to the later completed radars. This earlier system was located in southern Ukraine, and was reportedly able to detect rocket launches at the Baikonur Cosmodrome 1,600 miles away. A second prototype was able to detect missile launches from as far away as the Pacific Ocean. When the signals began in 1976, they were immediately heard around the world. The signal was so incredibly strong that it interfered with commercial aviation and shipping communications, civilian communications, and even disrupted television broadcasts. This prompted thousands of complaints. As mentioned, no one knew the exact source of the sound, but experts quickly established that the sound must be an over-the-horizon radar system. Naturally, the Duga systems were an extremely closely guarded secret. After the transmissions began, both amateur radio enthusiasts and NATO were able to triangulate the position of the radars inside the Soviet Union. Many countries complained to the USSR about the short-wave tapping sound, but they denied its existence. Even Soviet maps listed the location as a children's camp. One unconfirmed story details how when one of the first U.S. journalists allowed into Chernobyl after the meltdown asked about the huge structure on the horizon, he was told it was an unfinished hotel. Although people knowledgeable with radios knew the Russian woodpecker was some form of over-the-horizon radar, conspiracy theories began running rampant amongst the public. Ideas of mind and weather control were tossed around, while others feared the signal would destroy brain cells. The Chernobyl site would continue to be used until the nuclear disaster happened nearby, causing the Soviets to shut it down. Although the US were comfortable in their conclusion, they would not receive official confirmation until the Soviet Union collapsed in the 1990s. Even then, the exact details of the system still remain a mystery. The documents that contain information about the Duga radars and how they were used have either been destroyed or locked away long ago. Today, the mystery of the Russian woodpecker has been solved, but its eerie structure remains, rusting quietly away in the Chernobyl exclusion zone. Everyone thought about the question of whether there are mutants in Chernobyl. Since the accident at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, the area has become overgrown with thousands of legends that frighten the most incredible stories about the terrible zombie living in the vast radioactive lands. But is it true? Welcome. April 26, 1986, at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant there was an explosion, scattering hundreds or even thousands kilometers of life-threatening radionuclides, smeared the land for many years. Because of the accident, hundreds of people died, thousands became ill with oncology. Radiation did not spare plants and wildlife. In the first few years, small mutations were observed in newborn animals and humans. Mutants in the exclusion zone were not met. Except for cases of mutation of animals, they are supposedly associated with radiation. But it was not possible to prove it to scientists. Photo of the Chernobyl mutations animals after the accident at the nuclear power plant can say a lot about how much damage brought the disaster not only to people, but also to the animal world. The mutation in Chernobyl, the photo of which reflects all the bitterness of events, reached its highest values in the first 10 years after the disaster. It was during this period that animals were born with excess heads, muzzles, paws. Of the plant in the red forest. The affected area of the forest as a result of exposure to strong radiation has dozens of cases of mutation in trees, and especially in pine. On April 26, 1986, during the explosion, the Chernobyl nuclear power plant threw out so many radionuclides that the adjoining forest turned yellow. He was buried, and in his place grew a not quite healthy forest. Chernobyl. Mutants appeared due to radiation. Despite the fact that today the radiation doses have significantly decreased and the exposure dose rate does not exceed 1 to 3 Mr. H, a part of the young pine plantations receives doses leading to the formation of mutations in generative organs. It is important to note that radionuclides that are in the nutrient substrate, biomass buried in the trench in 1986, are also a source of irradiation of the stands of the red forest. Radioactive substances, entering plants together with nutrients through the root systems, form significant levels of internal irradiation. Below are photographs of the current state of the territory in which the dead forest was not buried in the trench. A significant part of the dead trees in the red forest area today lies on the ground. The territory is gradually overgrown with young growths of birch and pine. Natural processes of vegetative cover restoration occur. Radiation also affected the trees. Everyone remembers that red forest, which completely turned yellow after the accident, absorbing a large number of radionuclides. The forest was lost, but in its place grew new trees with small mutations. To this day, scientists are studying the effect of radiation on the nature of Chernobyl. It is worth noting that the wild nature after 31 years develops with great speed. The pollution did not affect many species. Science continues to study.
There is long said that a creature haunts Chernobyl, but is it true? Today we will find out. In 1986, the worst nuclear disaster the world has ever seen occurred at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. Abandoned for nearly a quarter of a century, witnesses believe that the spirits of those who died in the tragic accident still roam the town. At the start of April 1986, the people living and working at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, located near Pripyat, Ukraine, in the former Soviet Union, began to experience a series of strange events. Sightings of a creature, described as a large black, bird-like creature or a headless man with a 20-foot wingspan, and red eyes began to be reported by workers of the power plant. The creature would later become known as the Black Bird of Chernobyl. People who witnessed the black bird soon started to experience horrific nightmares, threatening phone calls, and some had first-hand encounters with the winged beast. Reports of these strange happenings continued to increase until the morning of April 26, 1986. At 1:23 a.m., reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in the former Soviet Union exploded. The power plant suffered a catastrophic steam explosion that resulted in a fire, causing a series of additional explosions followed by a nuclear meltdown. The power plant spewed a plume of radioactive fallout which drifted over parts of the Western Soviet Union, Eastern and Western Europe, Scandinavia, the UK, Ireland and Eastern North America within 48 hours. The radioactive fallout was 400 times greater than that of Hiroshima bomb and was the first level 7 event, described as a major accident, and the highest grade possible to occur on the International Nuclear Event Scale. The Chernobyl disaster, as the incident was dubbed, is considered the worst accident ever in the history of nuclear power. Following the meltdown, and subsequent explosions and fires, Soviet helicopters were dispatched to the scene, equipped with special fire-fighting gear. These helicopters circled the plant dropping clay, sand, lead and other extinguishing chemicals onto the burning facility. Most of the fire was put out by 5 a.m., but the fire burning in Reactor 4 continuing to blaze for several hours after. The firefighters who responded were unaware of the nature of the fire, assuming that it was simply an electrical fire, and received mass overdoses of radiation leading to many of their deaths. Many of the workers who survived the initial blast and fire claimed to have witnessed the large black, bird-like creature gliding through the swirling plumes of irradiated smoke pouring from the reactor. Most of these workers would later die of radiation poisoning. The catastrophe left the nearby Soviet city of Pripyat a radioactive ghost town. The morning of the catastrophe, the population of Pripyat was 50,000. By sunrise the following day, the entire population was evacuated, never to return. No further sightings of the black bird of Chernobyl were reported after the Chernobyl disaster, leaving researchers to speculate just what haunted the workers of the plant during the days leading up to the disaster. The most commonly accepted theory suggests that the black bird of Chernobyl may have been the same creature, dubbed the Mothman, that terrorized the population of Point Pleasant, West Virginia, leading up to the collapse of the Silver Bridge on December 15, 1968. Investigators have suggested that the appearance of this creature is an omen of disasters to come in the area in which it shows itself. The physical description of both the black bird of Chernobyl and the Mothman are very similar, and the reports of nightmares and threatening phone calls leading up to these disasters are shared in both cases. Both the black bird of Chernobyl and the Mothman have not been sighted since their respective disasters, leaving many unanswered questions. Pripyat, the nearby abandoned Chernobyl worker town, is believed to be haunted. People have had the feeling of being watched when walking past the city hospital. Apparitions and shadows are often seen. Some have even reported being touched. A harrowing account at Chernobyl was given by Andrei Karsukov, a nuclear physicist from the University of Buffalo, after visiting the site during 1997. This is what he had to say.
I arrived at the abandoned power station at about 7:30 a.m. I proceeded directly to the reactor 4 sarcophagus where the explosion took place. I could not enter, due to the radiation. I stood by the entrance taking radiation and Röntgen readings. I know no one could be inside the old reactor core, but I could very distinctly hear the sound of someone screaming for help, shouting that there was a fire inside. I ran upstairs to tell someone, but they said that when I entered the reactor control room, I was the first person to open that door in 3 years, and the only way to get inside the old reactor is through the doors I came in through. If someone had gone inside the reactor when I was not looking, they would have tripped an alarm that goes off when the reactor door is opened mechanically. The reactor door requires a password and a handprint, yet someone, or something was inside. Later that evening, as we were eating dinner outside the building by the river next to the plant, A floodlight turned on in the room of the installation. There was no way anyone could be inside. As we ate, we figured there was a power surge or something. Then, just as my colleague said that, the light turned off.
When Sci-Fi Channel's Destination Truth team conducted a paranormal investigation at Chernobyl, numerous incidents were recorded. After donning radioactive protection suits, the team investigated the remains of Reactor 4. They were shocked to see a human figure appear on a thermal imaging camera inside the reactor. Throughout their analysis of the abandoned hospital, the team continues to spot multiple figures moving in the seemingly abandoned building. As we left to go back to civilization, we were all overwhelmed with feelings of sadness and thinking of all the lost dreams that are there to stay. It's strange how human error can have such a massive effect, and although nobody lives there anymore, there is definitely something in the shadows. The government do not want you to know or see this, been hidden from the public for some time now. Welcome to the real Chernobyl. A 2021 view of the shelter construction covering the exploded reactor at the Chernobyl nuclear plant in Ukraine. More than 3 decades earlier, it was the site of history's worst nuclear disaster. A satellite image with overlaid graphics shows military vehicles alongside the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in Ukraine. The picture was taken February 25, 2022, just over a day after Russia launched its invasion of Ukraine. How the real control desk of the Chernobyl plant looked on April 18, 1986, just days before the disaster. Here's an aerial shot taken after the explosion, while the facility was still burning. It burned for roughly 10 days. Here are 2 brave photographers who took the first pictures of the Chernobyl disaster from a helicopter in April 1986. Here's another helicopter shot, this one taken a few days after the catastrophe. The site has since been domed by a protective cover. Soviet television showed, on April 30, 1986, this picture of the Chernobyl plant on which a half-destroyed building could be seen. However, the media insisted there had been no destruction, nor gigantic fires nor thousands of casualties. This undated picture, sent by Soviet television, show a man injured in the blast of number 4 reactor of Ukrainian Chernobyl nuclear plant. By October 1986, the number 4 reactor, the crux of the disaster, was emptombed as a part of an ongoing cleanup and security effort. In October 1989, a local woman holds up a disabled newborn pig, victim of the radioactive fallout. A sign advertises vegetables as free of contamination in a market in May 1986. God, it rains, reads the graffiti above the symbol for radioactivity on the wall of a house near Frankfurt, Germany, in May 1986. Ground-level radioactivity from nuclear fallout after the Soviet nuclear disaster rose significantly after weekend rains. A nurse at a children's health clinic in Warsaw administers an iodine solution to a 3-year-old girl held in her mother's arms in Poland in May 1986. Protective measures were taken for possible radiation poisoning from the Soviet nuclear accident. Soviet refugees are checked for radioactivity at a Vienna airport on April 30, 1986. A Swedish farmer wearing anti-atomic gear shifts fodder contaminated by the radioactive cloud of Chernobyl in June 1986. The evacuation of 47,000 inhabitants of Pripyat, in 1,200 buses and 200 trucks, only took a few hours. Locals believed they would be returning several days later. Instead, it became a ghost town. A worker wearing a protective overalls and mask works with boxes of contaminated vegetables on the landfill in Berlin in May 1986. These vegetables were banned by local authorities. Firefighters in protective suits cleaned cars at the German border in May 1986. The cars were coming from Poland and were largely contaminated. Oksana Gabin, Wright, 17, and Alla Kozimirka, 15, both victims of the disaster, receive infrared radiation treatment in Cuba in December 1986. Kathleen McIntyre of the Brookhaven National Laboratory Radiology Assistance Program demonstrates the use of a thyroid gland tester for radiation on a tourist who returned from the Soviet Union in New York in May 1986. 31 New Yorkers who came within 80 miles of the Soviet nuclear accident returned home 3 days early. Roswitha Freiser, who had a stall in the Frankfurt market for 25 years before the disaster, holds up a poster that reads, "The atoms have destroyed us," in May 1986. Marina Pappas, left, and Krissa Livanos, both mothers of students who returned from Kiev, hold up T-shirts reading, "Kiev was a blast 1986," at Kennedy International Airport in New York in May 1986. 20 high school students and 11 adults from Long Island, who came within 80 miles of the Soviet nuclear accident, returned home 3 days early. The residents of Pripyat never returned to their homes, businesses, pets. Here are some abandoned hotel rooms in the now ghost town in 2017. Today tourists often visit the town on specially organized tours from Kiev. Rusting equipment lies among peeling walls in a room at the abandoned city hospital on September 30, 2015 in Pripyat, Ukraine. Pripyat lies only a few kilometers from the site of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant and was built in the 1970s to house the plant's workers and their families. Today Pripyat is a ghost town, its apartment buildings, shops, restaurants, hospital, schools, cultural center and sports facilities derelict and its streets overgrown with trees. The city lies in the inner exclusion zone around Chernobyl. A rusting crib containing a baby doll and blanket sits in the Pripyat Hospital maternity ward, decades after the disaster. Hot spots of persistently high levels of radiation make this area uninhabitable for thousands of years to come. A doll and shoes lay on a bench in a nursery school in Pripyat in April 2016, 30 years after the disaster. A schoolbook lies on a pupil's desk next to a Cold War-era gas mask in a classroom of abandoned school number 3. Today, a partially constructed and abandoned cooling tower stands at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. Shot was taken in Pripyat in 2017. It shows a Geiger counter reading 679,000 counts per minute near a metal claw contaminated with radioactivity. The new safe confinement sarcophagus covers the destroyed reactor on November 29, 2016. Visitors walk next to the new dome over the fourth block of the Chernobyl nuclear plant in Chernobyl on October 5, 2018. The photo was taken ahead of the official opening ceremony of a new 1-megawatt power plant. In April 2018, tourists walk in a symbolic alley with signs bearing names of villages and cities evacuated following the Chernobyl disaster. A woman in a Ukrainian folk costume lays flowers to the Chernobyl victims' monument in the capital city of Kyiv, Ukraine, on April 26, 2021. That date marked the 35th anniversary of the Chernobyl nuclear disaster.
The eyewitnesses of the 1986 Chernobyl disaster in modern-day Ukraine, also known as the Chernobyl liquidators, recalled the horrors of the nuclear plant accident on the disaster's 35th anniversary. The accident, known as the world's worst nuclear disaster, occurred on April 26, 1986, at the fourth reactor in the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, 16 kilometers 10 miles apart from the city of Pripyat, which was built in the 1970s to house workers at the plant, in the north of the Ukrainian SSR. The catastrophic explosion, linked to inadequately trained personnel, at the fourth reactor exposed the core and threw clouds of radioactive material over the surrounding territory. The Chernobyl liquidators were the civil and military personnel who were called upon to deal with the consequences of the nuclear disaster in the Soviet Union on the site of the event starting from 1986, whose efforts to a big extent limited both the immediate and long-term damage from the disaster. Alexander Lyashenko, 57, who now lives in Voskresenoko village in Ukraine's Dnipropetrovsk region, said he spent exactly 30 days in liquidation works since June 1986. Serving as a chemistry specialist in the military, Lyashenko said he worked in a total of 12 rounds in the plant area for 1 month, adding that it was impossible to work longer at the high radiation areas due to health issues. Unlike others, being a chemistry specialist, we knew what we were going for and knew what the consequences would be if we didn't do it, Lyashenko told Anadolu Agency in an exclusive interview. Recalling his military service years 35 years ago, Lyashenko said he was sent on June 10 to the disaster zone as a liquidator to mitigate the consequences of the accident, adding that their military unit was based 30 kilometers (18.6 miles) apart from the disaster zone. At the disaster area, he said, radiation reconnaissance work was being done along with determining the duration of time a liquidator could spend at the radioactive spot. We were involved in cleaning and deactivation works of the 4th power plant. Every time after the work, we were having a bath, passing through the deactivation process, and were receiving new clothes before leaving to the military unit to rest, he said. Lyashenko said the first batch of people were dispatched to the disaster zone on April 26, while the second batch reached there on June 10 and was replacing the first comers. We were collecting the radioactive soil and taking it to the special area, collecting the pieces of uranium scattered after the explosion, cutting down the forest that was exposed to radiation, covering the 4th plant with lead rolls to reduce the radiation spread outside, he said. He underlined that for the whole work period, the allowed radiation dose that people could have been exposed was supposed not to exceed 25 Röntgen. But, in fact, the radiation dose that everyone was exposed there was much higher. Lyashenko said out of 400 liquidators from his neighborhood who joined the cleaning works in Chernobyl till 1988, only 120 remained alive. He recalled that while working in high radiation areas, the liquidators were given special military protection uniforms and respirators. However, those working in the lower dose areas were working just in an ordinary military uniform. Asked about the health consequences of the radioactive mission, Lyashenko said he is still having lots of post-Chernobyl health problems and disability. Ivan Bokin, 72, said he had been a liquidator of the Chernobyl disaster aftermath from October 19, 1987, and until March 6, 1988. Bokin said that working as a mechanic, he was involved in a process in which people were collecting the soil from the territory adjacent to the nuclear power plant, and taking it to the nearby 5 quarries, and then bringing back fresh soil to cover the territory for deactivating the radiation. All these procedures were being done by the trucks. I was on military service in a unit that was doing repair work of these trucks and special vehicles. On the highway from the nuclear plant till the city of Pripyat, there were mobile workshops engaged in repairing those vehicles, he said. He explained that before the repair works, the vehicles were being checked for the level of radiation, and based on that level, the time allowed to spend on the repair works was calculated. Everyone had a personal radiation dosimeter, he said. Our task was to make a fast repair of the vehicles. But, sometimes, we were finding out some hidden breakdown that was not noticed beforehand while preparing the repair time schedules. Therefore, the repair team was working until all breakdowns are solved, thus the level of radiation was exceeding the permissible radiation level. Bokin said their team was wearing masks and an ordinary work uniform, and no special uniform against the radiation was provided. Once reaching the military unit, the uniforms and vehicles were being cleaned with the means we had that time. The vehicles with overdose radiation were being taken to be stored in deep quarries, and then they were being buried by covering them by sand, he said. He went on to say that the radiation left big consensuses for all liquidators. All of us were officially recognized as disabled people. Within a month, 5 people from the same shift working with us passed away. Strong headache that I had after the Chernobyl disaster remains up to the current day, he added. Kamal Aliyev, 59, a liquidator who joined the Chernobyl teams from Azerbaijan, said he spent nearly a month until June 1986 at the disaster zone, where he was dispatched following his military service. We were working in the city of Pripyat in a concrete factory. There was a total of 4 concrete factories built in the area during a short period of time. The concrete produced in the factory was used to cover the areas exposed to radiation, he said. Sometimes there were areas with extreme radiation level where people in special uniform were allowed to work no more than 75 to 80 seconds at once and were coming back then, he said. Aliyev emphasized that special trucks and even helicopters were dumping concrete and sand on the area to bury the poisoners, radiation elements and contain the contamination. We were staying in a building 30 kilometers (18.6 miles) apart from the disaster zone. I still remember the friendship of nations. People from many nations across the Soviet Union hand by hand were working together to eliminate the disaster aftermath. He also highlighted that in a short period of time, people were evacuated from the area, adding that initially, the Soviet regime which invested heavily in nuclear power following World War II, was trying to hide the disaster but was unable to do so due to the scale of the catastrophe. After first denying any accident, the Soviets finally made a brief announcement on the nuclear accident on April 28. The USSR management evacuated around 335,000 people, establishing a 19-mile-wide exclusion zone around the reactor. Aliyev said more than 7,000 people from Azerbaijan actively participated in the mitigation of the consequences of the accident, adding that around 5,000 persons are currently suffering from the consequences of the Chernobyl accident in his country, while approximately 2,000 people affected by the Chernobyl accident have since passed away. According to the International Atomic Energy Agency, 400 times more radiation than the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima was released into the atmosphere with the Chernobyl disaster. Around 5 million people still live in areas with radiation risk in Belarus, Ukraine and Russia. The power plant is expected to be completely eliminated by 2065. Today, Chernobyl, although a close area, beckons to tourists who are intrigued by its history and its danger. Valery Kodemchuk's body remains permanently entombed inside the wreckage at Chernobyl over 35 years after the nuclear reactor meltdown. At least 31 people were killed directly on the night of the Chernobyl disaster, with countless more suffering in the aftermath. But the very first person to die in the incident has never been found. Valery Kodemchuk, 35, was a Ukrainian engineer working at the nuclear power plant on the night of the meltdown. An experienced pump operator, Valery was in one of the main circulation pump engine rooms in the Reactor 4 building when it started to malfunction. As the engineers commenced with their ill-fated safety test on the reactor, Kodemchuk was sent to the core to report on the results of the test once it had been completed. Seconds later, a series of explosions rocked the core and blew the 1,000-ton roof right off the reactor in an enormous radioactive fireball. Kodemchuk is believed to have died instantly in the explosion, and to this very day, his body has never been found, presumed to be entombed forever in the nuclear debris of Reactor 4. His death was reported on at the time by Soviet news outlet Pravda, who said, "The fourth reactor block will also become his coffin. And, perhaps, someone will write on those concrete walls, that it is not the reactor which is buried here, but Valery Kodemchuk." Fellow engineer Vladimir Shishyanok also died that evening trying to rescue Kodemchuk. The two men were the first to die at the disaster site that evening, with 29 firefighters and first responders dying of acute radiation poisoning in the coming weeks. A memorial dedicated to Kodemchuk was later built deep in the Unit 3, Unit 4 ventilation blocks, which is still there today. Although he never appears directly in the HBO Chernobyl miniseries, a photo of the real-life Kodemchuk is used in the series' final episode when he is mentioned. Underneath his portrait, the text reads, "Valery Kodemchuk's body was never recovered. He is permanently entombed under Reactor 4. Officially, the death toll for the incident is only 31, although it is believed thousands more people have died as a result of long-term radiation exposure in the years since. Estimates range from 4,000 to 27,000 by the Union of Concerned Scientists, whereas Greenpeace estimates that between 93,000 to 200,000 people died as a result of the disaster. In 2006, the recently deceased Mikhail Gorbachev wrote that the Chernobyl disaster, even more than my launch of perestroika, was perhaps the real cause of the collapse of the Soviet Union. In 2008, Kodemchuk was posthumously awarded with the Third-Degree Order for Courage by Viktor Yushchenko, the president of Ukraine. Viktor Brukhanov had devoted most of his adult life to the communist dream of bringing electricity to the USSR. Appointed to head the Chernobyl nuclear project when he was just 34 years old, and the site of the future plant was nothing more than a deserted field knee-deep in snow, Brukhanov was soft-spoken and well-liked by his staff, but overworked and browbeaten by his Communist Party bosses. By the spring of 1986, he was nonetheless on the brink of personal triumph. The Chernobyl plant was among the best-performing nuclear stations in the Soviet Union, and Pripyat, the city he had built to house the plant workers and their families, stood as a beacon of progress, a magnet for specialists from all over the USSR. With the approach of the May Day holiday, Brukhanov, now 50, was expecting news of a promotion to Moscow, along with state awards for the plant, despite being forced to cut corners and cook the books to meet quotas, and having helped cover up a serious plant accident in 1982. A year later, Brukhanov had also signed off on the launch of the station's newest and most advanced reactor, Reactor Unit Number 4, even though a key required safety test hadn't been carried out. When the test was rescheduled to take place during a regular maintenance shutdown of the reactor on April 25, 1986, Brukhanov's deputy, a party loyalist who had learned what little he knew of nuclear physics from a correspondence course, didn't even bother to tell his boss it was happening. As the administrative head of the entire Chernobyl enterprise, Brukhanov would be held personally responsible for anything that went wrong at the plant. When he first glimpsed the scale of the destruction of Unit 4, his first thought was, "I'm going to prison." One of the most experienced nuclear engineers at the Chernobyl station, Anatoly Dyatlov, had arrived in Ukraine from the top-secret Laboratory 23 in the Soviet Far East, where he had overseen a team installing reactors in the USSR's growing fleet of nuclear-powered submarines. But the manner Dyatlov had developed while working at the military laboratory didn't endear him to the young civilian staff of the nuclear power plant. They found the gray-haired Siberian harsh and dictatorial, and although Chernobyl workers respected him for the depth of his knowledge, many feared or even detested him. His insistence that they unquestioningly follow his orders to the letter and the power he wielded to punish those who disobeyed him. On the night of the accident, Dyatlov was responsible for overseeing the long-overdue safety test on reactor number 4. By the time it finally began, in the small hours of April 26, he was sleep-deprived and as ill-tempered as ever. When the young reactor engineer, Leonid Toptanov, made a mistake soon after taking over at the controls on the midnight shift, Dyatlov insisted on continuing with the test, even though Toptanov and safety protocols suggested otherwise. A graduate of the Moscow Engineering and Physics Institute, the esteemed Soviet counterpart to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Toptanov was just 25 years old when he took the controls of reactor number 4 on the night of the accident. Well-trained, independent-minded and something of a ladies' man, the mustachioed Toptanov, Lenya to his friends, had written his graduate thesis on fine points of reactor physics and knew that under certain circumstances the equipment under his control could be capricious and difficult to master. But he had also been a senior reactor operator for just 2 months and had never before piloted the reactor through the difficult shutdown process before. He was unaware of the numerous design faults that made accidents not merely possible, but likely, during the normal course of operation. A series of crucial missteps ensued, any one of which would not in themselves have caused a disaster. But in this case, they fell together in a deadly confluence. Before the ill-fated test began, Toptanov somehow skipped a step in the process of assuming control of the reactor, accidentally allowing its power output to fall almost to nothing. His training suggested he shut the reactor down, ending the important test before it had even begun. But Anatoly Dyatlov, the senior manager in the room, threatened Toptanov, forcing him to increase the reactor's power toward the level required for the test. That decision made it susceptible to reactor runaway, a terrifying process that, in a split second, could lead to a core meltdown or explosion. At the end of the test, which lasted just 36 seconds, Toptanov pressed the shutdown button of the emergency safety system, the system vulnerable to the most serious of the reactor's design faults, inadvertently precipitating its destruction. The resulting power surge inside the core led to a pair of explosions that blew the massive concrete lid off the reactor and destroyed the roof and upper reaches of the building around it. A happily married father of 2 grown children, Valery Legasov was 49 years old at the time of the accident and approaching the pinnacle of his career at the top of the Soviet scientific establishment. He had won all but one of the state's most prestigious prizes for his work and expected to be appointed head of the Institute of Atomic Energy as soon as his boss and mentor, the octogenarian nuclear chief Anatoly Alexandrov, retired. The son of a leading party ideologue, Legasov was a true believer in communism and politically beyond reproach. Living in a grand villa a short walk from his office at the institute, he was also a keen athlete who skied, played tennis and wrote poetry in his spare time. He learned that an accident had occurred at the Chernobyl plant in Ukraine during a regular party meeting on the morning of Saturday, April 26. A radiochemistry specialist, he knew little about nuclear reactors, but was ordered to join a government commission, flown to the scene to take control of the emergency and immediately put in charge of containing the consequences of the explosion. What Legasov witnessed in Chernobyl would change the course of his life. The chaos and incompetence he saw shook his confidence in socialism. The radiation dose he received shattered his health, and his subsequent attempts to reform the Soviet scientific system destroyed his career. A grizzled apparatchik at the head of the USSR's fuel and energy industries, Sherbina was preparing to give a speech to workers in an oil field near the border with Kazakhstan when he received an urgent summons from Moscow to fly to Ukraine to take charge of managing the developing disaster in Chernobyl. At 66, balding, bulldog-faced and sure of himself, the minister was an old hand in the ways of the system, its patterns of absurd quotas and preposterous deadlines. As chairman of the government's Chernobyl Commission, Sherbina was responsible not only for bringing the catastrophe under control but investigating its consequences. Without his approval, nothing could happen inside the exclusion zone that soon surrounded the remains of reactor number 4. Arriving on the scene on the evening following the explosion, he projected the brash confidence expected of senior Soviet managers. Not only did he disregard the need for personal radiation protection, but he dismissed calls for immediate evacuation of the city of Pripyat as the wayward opinions of panic-mongering weaklings. It was not until almost 36 hours after a pillar of toxic radionuclides began pouring from the wreckage of the reactor that the city's residents were finally allowed to leave. Arriving in Pripyat in 1979, fresh from school at the age of 16, Lyudmila took a bed in a student dormitory and a job as a pastry chef in the canteen of the Chernobyl nuclear plant. Soon after, she met Vasily Ignatenko, a young fireman at the city's paramilitary fire station number 6. Stocky and thick-set, Ignatenko was charming and talkative, and the champion athlete of the brigade, a regular in the competitive firefighting championships held throughout the USSR. The couple married in 1983 and moved into a small one-bedroom flat in the annex above the fire station reserved for members of the brigade and their families. They gathered blueberries and wild mushrooms in the countryside around the city and barbecued in the garden with their friends from the station. Lyudmila became pregnant with twins, but miscarried. By the spring of 1986, she was expecting once again. Born to Sino-Russian parents in China, raised in the Soviet Union, but excluded from the Communist Party by her foreign birth, Protsenko brought an outsider's zeal to her work in Pripyat before the accident. Working with scant supplies of precious materials, she imparted beauty and individuality to the standardized buildings of the city. Short but formidable, she patrolled the streets with a ruler, berating construction teams for shoddy workmanship and lashing them with invective as she oversaw plans to expand Pripyat from a town of 50,000 to one of 200,000. As radiation from the explosion of reactor number 4 began to engulf the town, Protsenko was responsible for organizing the evacuation. She planned the escape of every family from each apartment block in Pripyat, and, as more than 1,000 buses arrived to take them to safety, she stood at the entrance to the city with a map and gave the drivers instructions on where to go. As the last one departed, Protsenko remained behind, convinced by party assurances that the citizens would soon return to the homes she had helped build. Months later, she would still be at her desk in the heart of the newly created 30-kilometer exclusion zone when a KGB officer arrived. His request, to help map a fence intended to permanently seal off the city she helped create from the outside world.
In the early hours of April 26, 1986, reactor number 4 at Chernobyl hummed with ordinary energy, unaware of the chaos that would soon be unleashed. Engineers ran late-night tests, a routine meant to improve safety systems. But a cascade of errors, human, mechanical, and procedural, set the stage for catastrophe. The reactor exploded, and in that instant, human error birthed a nightmare that can never be unseen. In the molten core of the reactor, materials that should never mix fused into a strange, horrifying substance, the elephant's foot. When scientists first laid eyes on it days later, they were confronted with something that seemed alive, a pulsating, blackened mass of uranium, sand, concrete, and steel. It was the physical manifestation of nuclear fury. Those who dared approach it had their dosimeters scream in alarm. Radiation levels so intense, exposure for even minutes could be fatal. One scientist recounted later, "We walked down the corridor. The floor beneath our feet seemed ordinary. But the moment we turned the corner, it was like looking into the heart of a sun. I felt my stomach drop. The Geiger counters were going wild. We couldn't stay. It was impossible." The elephant's foot was not just an object. It was a silent predator, born of molten chaos. The room felt alive, almost breathing. The walls, blackened and twisted, reflected the airy glow of the molten mass. It seemed to shift, as if conscious, settling and oozing slowly, a reminder of the reactor's violence. Even today, decades later, the elephant's foot sits beneath layers of concrete and steel. Its radioactivity has decreased, yes, but it still remains one of the deadliest objects ever created by mankind. A single glance, a single misstep could end life in minutes. And yet, humanity cannot look away. Curiosity drives people to study it, to understand it. Scientists probe it with remote cameras, drones, and lead-lined equipment. The elephant's foot is a warning, a monument to human hubris, a glowing testament to the invisible dangers we created and cannot fully control. As the camera pans to the abandoned halls of Pripyat, flickering lights reveal remnants of a city frozen in 1986. Children's toys sit in classrooms, notebooks open on desks, as if waiting for students who never returned. The elephant's foot is far below, but its presence haunts every corner of the disaster zone, a molten shadow over a world forever changed. This is the object that should not exist, and yet, it does. April 25, 1986, 11 p.m. The night was quiet in Pripyat, a small Soviet city built for the workers of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. Lights glimmered in apartment windows, children slept in their beds, and somewhere deep underground, reactor number 4 hummed with a false sense of security. Engineers were preparing for a routine safety test, a shutdown procedure to see how the reactor would respond during a power outage. It was considered low risk, a simple check of the systems. But the reactor was unstable, already operating at dangerously low power levels, and the operators were pressured to finish quickly. Inside the control room, tension buzzed beneath the surface. Screens flickered, alarms chimed faintly, and men in uniform moved with a mixture of confidence and fatigue. Small mistakes compounded, a safety system disabled here, a warning ignored there, a perfect storm waiting to ignite. At 1:23 a.m. on April 26, the unthinkable happened. A sudden surge of energy ripped through reactor number 4. Steam pressure built faster than the systems could handle. The reactor groaned, twisted, and then an explosion so powerful it shook the building, sent debris flying, and tore a hole into the heart of the facility. Outside, residents of Pripyat felt the tremor like a distant earthquake. A flicker of orange light cut through the night sky above the plant. Some assumed that was a small accident, nothing more. But deep within the reactor, the molten core was beginning to form something horrific. This was the birth of the elephant's foot. As graphite and uranium fused under immense heat, materials it should never meet became a living, seething mass. Concrete, sand, and steel were swallowed in a wave of molten nuclear fire. It oozed slowly, black and terrifying, into the lower levels of the reactor. The temperature was so high that it melted through floors and walls, creating a glowing river of radioactive death. Firefighters and plant workers rushed to the scene. They had no idea what they were facing. Armed with nothing more than basic gear, they entered the reactor hall, unaware that a single glance at the molten core could be fatal. Geiger counters screamed, radiation levels soared, but the men pressed on, driven by duty, ignorance, and desperation. One firefighter recalled, "The heat was unbearable. It was like walking next to a furnace. The air burned our lungs. But we had to act. There was nothing to stop the chaos, only fire and radiation, and the people depending on us outside." Meanwhile, the reactor continued to burn. Graphite caught fire, smoke filled the night sky, and the first signs of radiation poisoning began appearing in those who were closest. No one knew the full extent of the danger. Deep below, the elephant's foot continued to grow, absorbing everything it touched, an invisible killer forming silently while the world slept. By dawn, the scale of the disaster became horrifyingly clear. Emergency alarms, frantic radio calls, and the first hospital admissions revealed the truth that no one could have imagined. This was not a simple accident. It was the beginning of a nuclear catastrophe that would leave a scar on humanity and a molten warning beneath the ruins. The elephant's foot, though unseen by most, had already started its silent reign of terror, and the night Chernobyl exploded would be remembered forever, not just for the human lives lost, but for the creation of one of the most dangerous objects on Earth. The horror was just beginning. Beneath the shattered remains of reactor number 4, a river of molten metal slowly carved its way through layers of concrete, steel, and graphite. It glowed with an otherworldly light, illuminating the darkness like a heartbeat from the core of the Earth itself. This was no ordinary molten material. The elephant's foot was a chaotic fusion of uranium fuel, reactor core components, sand, and concrete, forced together by heat exceeding 2,000 degrees Celsius. As it oozed downward, it hardened into a solid mass, black, glossy, wrinkled like the hide of some monstrous creature, yet still radiating lethal energy. The mass earned its name for its strange resemblance to the rough, wrinkled texture of an elephant's leg, but the comparison was the only familiar thing about it. In every other way, it was utterly alien, a creation of extreme heat, nuclear reactions, and human error. Scientists who first approached it described something horrifying. The air felt heavy, almost alive. The mass seemed to move, not like a liquid, but like it was breathing. Geiger counters were going off the charts. You could feel it in your bones. Invisible, unstoppable, pure danger. At the time, the radiation levels were so intense that exposure for just minutes could prove fatal. A single visit without protective gear could lead to death within hours. And yet the elephant's foot continued to expand slowly, melting through the floor, creeping toward lower levels of the reactor building. This molten nightmare contained a terrifying combination. Uranium fuel, the heart of the nuclear reaction. Graphite moderator, igniting and fueling the spread of fire. Concrete and sand, vaporized by the heat, then fused into the mass. Steel reinforcements, twisted and absorbed into the molten flow. As it cooled, it formed layers of deadly crystalline structures. These layers were so radioactive that even years later, workers required remote cameras and lead shielding to study it safely. But radiation wasn't the only danger. The elephant's foot was chemically unstable. In its molten form, it could shift, crack, and crumble unpredictably. It emitted heat, radioactive particles, and toxic gases, making every approach a test of courage and human ingenuity. Over the following days, scientists realized the magnitude of what they were facing. The elephant's foot wasn't just a mass of molten material, it was a symbol of the disaster, a physical embodiment of the reactor's fury. It absorbed everything in its path, yet remained invisible to the untrained eye, lurking below the rubble, a silent predator beneath the ruins. Even today, the elephant's foot remains a chilling reminder that human ambition, technology, and error can combine to create something terrifyingly beyond our control. And that some objects, once formed, can outlast time itself, glowing silently, lethally, and eternally in the darkness. The corridors beneath reactor number 4 were silent, except for the steady, shrill beep of Geiger counters. The air was thick with dust, the faint acrid smell of burnt graphite, and a danger so invisible it could not be ignored. Days after the explosion, a small team of scientists and engineers descended into the lower levels. They knew they were approaching something extraordinary, yet no one could fully grasp the magnitude of what waited for them. When they first saw it, the elephant's foot was glowing faintly, like a sinister molten stone, blackened and wrinkled, lying in twisted pools of fused concrete and steel. It seemed impossible, almost unreal. The mass exuded a heat that was tangible even from a distance. One scientist recalled with horror, The moment I turned the corner, my Geiger counter went haywire. It felt like the floor itself was alive, whispering danger. I knew that if I stepped closer, I wouldn't live to tell the story. Radiation readings were astronomical. 1 hour of exposure could have killed the entire team. Yet curiosity and duty forced them to stay, using long poles, lead shields, and remote cameras to document the deadly mass. Every measurement was a race against time, and a gamble with life. The elephant's foot had formed several layers, each more lethal than the last. Scientists found that the outer layers had begun to cool, but the inner core remained molten, trapped energy slowly leaking radiation into the surrounding concrete and steel. It was a living, breathing hazard defying comprehension. The reality was terrifying. Just standing near it for a few minutes could cause acute radiation syndrome. The radiation was so intense that even walls and floors absorbed dangerous levels, making the entire area a long-term hazard. Instruments sometimes malfunctioned, unable to cope with the sheer intensity. Yet despite the danger, this first contact allowed the world to see the elephant's foot for the first time. Photographs and film captured its strange, wrinkled surface and glowing edges. Geiger counters screamed. Thermometers showed impossibly high temperatures. And still, it oozed, a silent predator beneath the ruins. As the sciences withdrew, they realized something chilling. This mass of molten metal and concrete would remain deadly for decades. It could kill without warning, unseen and unassuming, to anyone who underestimated it. In those first terrifying encounters, humanity had touched the core of disaster. The elephant's foot was not just an object, it was a warning. A grim monument to what could happen when human ambition, technology, and error collide. And though it remained hidden beneath layers of shielding and rubble, it would haunt the world's imagination forever. Years after the explosion, reactor number 4 still whispered warnings. Beneath layers of steel and concrete, the elephant's foot remained, a molten heart frozen in time, but still radiating lethal energy. Its presence was a silent threat. Invisible, odorless, yet powerful enough to kill within minutes. For scientists and engineers involved in the cleanup, the mass was a constant terror. Protective suits, lead shields, and remote equipment became essential, but even then, the threat was relentless. Geiger counters screamed at every step. Radiation levels fluctuated unpredictably. It was a deadly game of inches. Dr. Leonid Toptunov, a young reactor engineer at the time, described the cleanup. We felt like ghosts walking in a haunted house. Every corridor, every shadow held danger. The elephant's foot was the ultimate predator, patient, unseen, and immortal. You could see it for a few moments, but its power was impossible to measure fully. Cleanup crews known as the liquidators worked tirelessly to stabilize the reactor and contain the disaster. They wore heavy suits, masks, and respirators, but the radiation was so extreme that exposure times were limited to mere minutes. Tasks that should have taken hours were reduced to frantic, heart-pounding seconds. The elephant's foot was not just a physical hazard. Its presence affected strategy, planning, and even morale. Entire sections of the plant became no-go zones, off-limits to humans. Engineers relied on cameras, robotic arms, and complex shielding systems to study it from afar. Even small miscalculations could prove fatal. Yet the mass was a strange mix of terror and fascination. Scientists studied it relentlessly, documenting its layers, temperature, and radiation patterns. They discovered that over time, the mass had begun to cool and crystallize, forming dense, wrinkled layers of uranium and concrete, but it remained lethally radioactive. By 1988, the elephant's foot had been measured at levels high enough to kill 100 people in an hour if unprotected. The world was watching, yet few understood the full scope. News reports painted Chernobyl as a tragic accident, but beneath the headlines, the elephant's foot remained a silent, glowing monster, proof of a disaster that refused to die. The story of the elephant's foot became a lesson in humility. It reminded humanity that some creations are too dangerous to touch, too powerful to fully control, and too alive to ignore. Its molten heart had frozen in place, but its shadow extended far beyond the reactor, shaping cleanup efforts, nuclear policy, and the understanding of radiation hazards for generations to come. And so the mass continued its silent vigil, a lethal monument buried beneath layers of stone and steel, waiting, as it always would, in the dark. Beneath the ruins of reactor number 4, the elephant's foot glows faintly through layers of steel and concrete, a silent testament to the raw power of nuclear energy. It is beautiful and terrifying, a reminder that the forces we unleashed can never fully be tamed. Radiation is invisible. It cannot be smelled, touched, or seen by human eyes. Yet it flows relentlessly from the elephant's foot, releasing particles and energy that can alter cells, damage DNA, and kill without warning. This is why scientists feared it. The danger was silent and invisible, making every approach a gamble with life itself. The mass is made mostly of uranium fuel, fused with reactor materials under extreme heat. Uranium naturally decays, releasing alpha, beta, and gamma radiation. Gamma rays are the most dangerous because they can penetrate walls, concrete, and even protective suits, delivering lethal doses to anyone nearby. To put it in perspective, standing near the elephant's foot for just 5 minutes in 1986 could have given a person a lethal dose of radiation. Even today, decades later, the mass is millions of times more radioactive than a typical nuclear reactor core. Scientists can only study it from a distance, using heavily shielded instruments, remote cameras, and specialized robotics. But radiation is not just a measure of death, it is a storyteller. By studying the elephant's foot, scientists learned how materials fused, how heat moved through the reactor, and how molten nuclear fuel behaves under catastrophic conditions. It became a natural laboratory, terrifying yet invaluable. The process that formed it, called corium formation, is both extraordinary and dangerous. Corium is essentially molten nuclear fuel that can melt through concrete, carrying radioactive material into the earth if unchecked. The elephant's foot is the most infamous example in human history. Even small fragments of the mass emit deadly radiation. When the outer layer hardened, it formed a dense, crystalline shell. Inside, molten uranium and fission products continue to emit energy, slowly losing power over decades, but still capable of instant death to anyone who underestimated it. And then there's the psychological impact. Scientists report that even knowing the elephant's foot is buried beneath the reactor changes how they approach nuclear safety. It is a ghost, a constant reminder of human error, hubris, and the terrifying consequences of technology gone wrong. Walking near it is walking beside death itself, invisible, silent, relentless. For the world outside, it is almost unimaginable. A glowing, toxic object lies beneath ruins, untouchable, unyielding, a monument to what happens when energy exceeds control. Humanity created it. Humanity cannot fully destroy it, and humanity must always remember it. The elephant's foot is not just a relic, it is a warning, one that still burns, invisibly and lethally, beneath the shattered heart of Chernobyl. Step into the exclusion zone of Chernobyl, and you enter a place where nature and radiation coexist in uneasy silence. Buildings crumble, streets crack, and wind whispers through empty classrooms and playgrounds. Here, humanity has vanished, leaving only shadows and memories behind. The elephant's foot, though buried deep beneath reactor number 4, continues to shape this land. Radiation has seeped into soil, water, and structures, leaving an invisible fingerprint on every surface. Trees grow strangely twisted, animals thrive in some ways, yet carry mutations in others. It is a paradox, life surviving amidst the lingering poison of human error. Scientists call this the exclusion zone, a 26-kilometer radius of silence and decay. It is both a warning and a living laboratory where the long-term effects of radiation are studied and where the elephant's foot remains the dark heart of it all. Biologists and environmental researchers describe it as surreal. The city of Pripyat is frozen in time. Every corner tells a story. Toys left in classrooms, grocery stores still stocked with expired food, bikes leaning against walls. And all the while, beneath our feet, the elephant's foot glows, a silent reminder of what humans can unleash. Radiation affects not just life, but perception. Long-term exposure to even low levels of radiation can alter ecosystems, and in some cases, the DNA of living creatures. Birds, wolves, and even small insects have adapted in strange ways. Some scientists argue that the exclusion zone has become an accidental wildlife sanctuary, a place where humans are absent, but danger is omnipresent. The elephant's foot itself is a central player in this frozen theater. Though decades old, its core is still hot. Any attempt to excavate, move, or disturb it would trigger deadly radiation spikes. Its molten past has left a permanent scar, a reminder that some human creations cannot be undone. Even today, drones and remote instruments survey the zone, measuring radiation and mapping hotspots. Engineers and scientists know better than to go near it. Protective suits, lead barriers, and robotic arms are the only safe ways to study it. And yet, the zone is hauntingly beautiful. The sun glints off rusted metal, trees sway in the wind, and animals roam freely where humans once lived. The elephant's foot remains hidden, glowing beneath the surface, a reminder that danger can exist in silence, and that even in the absence of humans, the world remembers. The land has become a monument, not just to the disaster itself, but to the lessons we failed to learn. Humanity's ambition and oversight created this glowing horror, and now it watches silently, shaping life and death from beneath the ruins. In the exclusion zone, time has frozen, and beneath it all, the elephant's foot waits, still deadly, still glowing, still alive in its invisible, silent way. The streets of Pripyat are empty, yet echoes of human life remain. Footsteps, laughter, arguments, all frozen in time, like ghosts trapped within crumbling walls. And far below, the elephant's foot glows, a silent predator watching over a land emptied by disaster. When the explosion occurred, thousands of people were thrown into chaos. Workers, firefighters, and residents faced dangers they could not comprehend. Radiation was invisible, yet lethal, striking without warning. Many of the first responders, later known as the liquidators, were unaware of the elephant's foot's formation or the levels of exposure they faced. Ivan, a firefighter who entered reactor number 4 on that first night, recalled decades later, "We didn't know what we were walking into. Smoke, heat, alarms, all of it overwhelming. But the deadliest part was invisible. I could feel it in my chest, in my skin, but I couldn't see it. It was like fighting a shadow that wanted to kill you." These liquidators worked tirelessly, often for mere minutes at a time, donning heavy suits, lead shields, and respirators. Every step was measured, every movement calculated. Yet the elephant's foot remained untouchable, a glowing heart of danger no man could conquer. Survivors tell stories of sickness, sudden weakness, hair loss, and nausea, the first signs of acute radiation syndrome. Families were evacuated, never to return, leaving behind homes, schools, and memories. And still, some could not comprehend what had happened beneath the reactor floor. Scientists and engineers documented these stories, understanding that the human cost of Chernobyl extended far beyond immediate fatalities. Radiation exposure caused long-term health effects, cancers, mutations, and life-altering illness for those who came in contact with the fallout. Yet there was courage. Men and women risked their lives to contain the disaster, knowing each moment brought them closer to invisible death. Drones, lead-line cameras, and remote-controlled machinery became lifelines in a war against the unseen. The elephant's foot became symbolic, not just of the reactor's destructive power, but of human resilience and tragedy. It silently judged each step taken in its shadow. The glow beneath the rubble was a constant reminder that even when disasters is hidden, its effects reach far and wide. Even today, decades later, scientists continue to study its influence on human physiology, survival, and memory. The liquidator stories, combined with the deadly power of the elephant's foot, ensure that Chernobyl's lessons are never forgotten. Human bravery met invisible death, and the elephant's foot watched silently, glowing beneath the ruins, a reminder that some mistakes cannot be undone. Decades have passed, but the elephant's foot remains one of the deadliest objects ever created by humans. Buried beneath reactor number 4, it glows faintly, untouchable, and unforgiving. Yet, curiosity has never died. Scientists, researchers, and even a few daring explorers have attempted to study the mass. Cameras, drones, and robots are now used to document it from a safe distance. Protective suits and lead shielding are mandatory. Even inches can mean a lethal dose of radiation. Dr. Alexey Yablokov, a leading researcher, explained, "We cannot touch it. We cannot get close. We can only observe." And yet, every observation reveals something extraordinary: the sheer resilience of this mass, its structure, and its continued emission of lethal radiation. It is like studying a living ghost. Over the years, the elephant's foot has become the subject of myths and urban legends. Some claim that even approaching it brings misfortune. Others say it breathes or moves in subtle, inexplicable ways. Of course, these are often exaggerations, but they serve to remind us that it is not just a physical threat, but a psychological one. Scientific studies reveal that the mass continues to undergo slow decay, emitting gamma rays and heat. Even with shields and robotics, the elephant's foot cannot be fully measured, and its deadly energy has earned it a permanent place in nuclear lore. The area around reactor number 4 is monitored continuously. Drones fly over the ruins, sensors measure radiation levels, and scientists analyze data to understand its long-term effects. But the elephant's foot remains elusive, hidden beneath layers of concrete, an invisible force that commands both respect and fear. Explorers who attempt to enter the exclusion zone today are warned repeatedly. Radiation is unpredictable, and the mass has an uncanny ability to affect instruments and detectors. Those who study it speak of an uneasy silence, a palpable sense that something watches, a reminder that human curiosity must always be tempered by caution. Yet fascination persists. The elephant's foot is not just a relic, it is a monument to human error, a glowing witness to history, and a challenge to those who dare to understand it. It reminds us of the immense power we can unleash and the fragility of life when faced with forces beyond our control. Even in the modern era, it continues to inspire awe and terror. A monumental warning beneath the ruins, impossible to ignore, impossible to conquer. The elephant's foot waits silently, glowing and lethal, beneath the shadow of reactor number 4, a silent predator watching a world that dares not forget. Decades have passed since the world first glimpsed the horrors of reactor number 4. Yet beneath the ruins, hidden from sight but impossible to ignore, the elephant's foot remains, a glowing, silent witness to the dangers of human ambition and hubris. The mass is more than molten metal and fused concrete. It is a symbol of warning, a testament to what happens when knowledge is misapplied, safety protocols fail, and ambition overrides caution. Its creation was instantaneous, catastrophic, and irreversible, yet its presence continues to shape the world in subtle, terrifying ways. For scientists, it remains a study in extremes. Its radiation, heat, and chemical structure provide insight into nuclear physics, disaster mitigation, and the resilience of materials under catastrophic conditions. Every measurement taken, every observation recorded adds to our understanding, but even now it cannot be fully tamed. For humanity at large, the elephant's foot is a reminder. It warns of our fragile control over technology, the consequences of ignoring safety, and the invisible dangers that lurk in even the most controlled systems. The glow beneath Chernobyl is more than dangerous energy. It is a legacy of hubris, a scar upon the earth that time cannot erase. In the abandoned streets of Pripyat, where toys lie untouched and schools stand silent, its presence is felt indirectly. The exclusion zone is a living reminder that decisions, errors, and ambition ripple across decades, shaping lives, ecosystems, and memories. And yet, the elephant's foot is also a story of human courage. Scientists, firefighters, and liquidators risked everything to study, contain, and understand it. Their bravery reminds us that curiosity and knowledge are powerful tools, but they demand respect. Misused, they can create horrors. Respected, they illuminate truths about the world we inhabit. As we look at the elephant's foot today, glowing faintly beneath layers of concrete, we are left with a chilling realization. Some creations cannot be undone. Some dangers are eternal. Some mistakes leave a mark that time cannot heal. It waits silently, unseen, lethal, and eternal, a glowing reminder of the night humanity touched fire and almost paid the ultimate price. The elephant's foot is a warning, a legacy, and a story that will never be forgotten. Because some objects should never exist, yet in the molten heart of Chernobyl, they do.
The night the world almost ended began quietly, but inside Reactor 4 at Chernobyl, a ticking time bomb was about to explode. April 1986, Pripyat, a city alive with children playing and workers walking to their shifts, was completely unaware of the invisible threat looming just miles away. At the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, Reactor 4 operated under a delicate balance of pressure, temperature, and human oversight. One wrong move, one ignored alarm, one miscalculation, and it would all unravel in a catastrophic chain reaction. This is the story of the night that changed everything, of human error, of technology pushed to its limits, and of a disaster that shook the world to its core. At 1:23 a.m. on April 26, 1986, Reactor 4 at Chernobyl hummed with quiet efficiency. Inside the control room, operators prepared for a safety test that was meant to simulate a power outage. On paper, it was routine. In reality, it was a disaster waiting to happen. The team followed the procedures meticulously, unaware that the reactor's design had hidden flaws that made it dangerously unstable at low power. Alarms flickered briefly, warnings that would have seemed minor under normal circumstances. Pressure gauges fluctuated, temperature readings crept higher than they should have, and yet, the operators pressed on. Time slowed as tension built. The control rods, critical to regulating the reaction, moved slower than expected. Steam began to hiss through the pipes at unnatural speeds. The operators exchanged glances, a silent unease passing between them, though none could fully grasp the magnitude of what was about to unfold. Suddenly, an abnormal surge raced through the core. The reactor's heart, a delicate lattice of uranium and graphite, began to overheat uncontrollably. The cooling system struggled to keep up. The sound of water boiling into steam filled the room, a terrifying, almost alien roar. And then, a deafening explosion, a blinding flash. The reactor tore itself apart, sending a fireball into the night sky. The force of the blast shattered walls, knocked operators off their feet, and hurled debris across the plant. Within moments, a silent killer had been unleashed. Radiation, invisible and deadly, spreading without mercy. In the chaos, the operators could only watch. Some rushed to contain the damage, others froze in shock, realizing that nothing in their training had prepared them for this.
Each heartbeat was measured against the invisible danger creeping closer with every second. The fateful night had begun, and nothing would ever be the same. The world was about to witness a disaster of unprecedented scale, a combination of human error, flawed technology, and faith converging in a catastrophic crescendo. The moment the reactor exploded, a wave of chaos swept through Chernobyl. The night sky lit up with an unnatural glow, a fiery plume rising into the darkness. Inside the plant, alarms blared relentlessly, a sound that would haunt the survivors forever. Firefighters were the first to respond, rushing toward the inferno with only basic protective gear. Many had no idea what they were truly facing. The air was thick with radioactive dust, invisible but deadly. Each step brought them closer to an invisible killer that would claim lives in hours, days, and even decades. Inside the plant, the operators scrambled to understand what had just occurred. Control panels sparked and flickered. Cooling systems were damaged or destroyed. Every second was a battle against time, against radiation, against forces no human had intended to confront. Outside, the city of Pripyat remained largely unaware. Residents slept while the invisible cloud began its silent, relentless spread. Some workers and guards tried to warn them, but the full scale of the disaster was impossible to comprehend. Back at the reactor, the damage was catastrophic. The core had ruptured, sending radioactive particles high into the atmosphere. Steam, smoke, and fire billowed outward, consuming equipment, melting metal, and destroying everything in its path. The physical explosion was terrifying, but the invisible threat was far worse. Radiation readings spiked off the charts, dosimeters failing to keep pace with the deadly energy being released. The brave men who remained at the plant faced impossible choices: stay to prevent further catastrophe or flee and survive. Many would not survive. In those first hours, the scale of the disaster was still unclear, but one fact was undeniable. Chernobyl had become the epicenter of the world's worst nuclear nightmare. The repercussions of this single night would ripple across the globe, affecting lives, politics, and the very perception of nuclear power for generations to come. As the explosion's fireball died down, the human toll began to emerge. The first responders, firefighters, and plant workers bore the brunt of the disaster. Many had no idea the invisible killer they faced, radiation, could silently and relentlessly destroy their bodies from the inside. Symptoms appeared almost immediately: nausea, dizziness, and burning sensations that no medicine could relieve. Some collapsed in the streets, their skin reddened, their energy drained in moments. Others carried on, driven by duty, unaware that each step was stealing precious hours, days, or even weeks of their lives. Families in Pripyat remained in the dark, oblivious to the invisible cloud spreading above them. Parents took their children into bed, workers returned home after shifts, and the city continued its ordinary rhythm, all under the shadow of a danger they could not see, smell, or hear. The plant workers faced impossible choices. Some stayed behind to stabilize systems, while others fled in fear. Those who approached the reactor to contain the damage were exposed to lethal levels of radiation, sometimes for only minutes, yet that was enough to guarantee severe illness or death. Even in hospitals, chaos reigned. Doctors and nurses treated victims with little understanding of what they were facing. Protective measures were minimal. Knowledge about radiation poisoning was limited. The human cost was not just immediate, it would echo for decades, affecting survivors, their families, and generations to come. Every story told from that night carries the weight of courage, desperation, and tragedy. Heroes emerged, risking everything to prevent an even greater catastrophe, while others suffered in silence, their lives forever changed.
Chernobyl was no longer just a technical disaster. It had become a human tragedy, a sobering reminder of how fragile life is when faced with forces beyond comprehension. With the reactor still burning and radiation levels climbing to deadly heights, the urgent question became, how do you stop a disaster that cannot be touched? Engineers, scientists, and soldiers were thrown into an impossible fight against an invisible enemy. Every decision carried life or death consequences. Helicopters hovered above the shattered reactor, dropping tons of sand, boron, and other materials intended to smother the core and slow the reaction. Each pilot knew the risks, radiation doses that would be fatal within hours. Still, they flew, guided by duty and the desperate hope of containing what seemed uncontrollable. On the ground, crews built the first makeshift containment structures. Concrete was poured, steel reinforced. But every attempt to shield the reactor felt painfully insufficient. Radiation seeped through protective barriers, invisible and insidious. Workers monitored readings with instruments that beeped faster than anyone could process, warning of levels that no human body was meant to endure. Despite the danger, remarkable ingenuity emerged. Engineers improvised, soldiers obeyed orders with precision, and ordinary men performed extraordinary acts of courage. Some worked for hours, exposed to lethal doses simply to prevent an even larger catastrophe. Others succumbed quietly, their bravery acknowledged only in fleeting whispers. Yet containment was not immediate. The reactor continued to release radioactive particles, the invisible cloud spreading across the plant and into the surrounding land. Each measure bought precious time, but it was a temporary victory in a battle that would leave scars for generations. Chernobyl's containment efforts revealed both the fragility and resilience of humanity. In the face of a disaster that defied comprehension, people risked everything, confronting a silent enemy that could kill without warning, without mercy, and without distinction. Amid the chaos and destruction, one of the most terrifying discoveries awaited those brave enough to enter Reactor 4. Deep within the heart of the wreckage lay what would come to be known as the Elephant's Foot, a mass of molten nuclear fuel, concrete, and steel fused together in a nightmarish form. This lump of radioactive material was unlike anything anyone had seen. It radiated at levels so extreme that a single minute in its proximity could be fatal. Yet engineers and scientists had no choice but to study it, to understand what had happened, and to plan the next steps to prevent further disaster. The Elephant's Foot was a stark reminder of the reactor's destructive potential. It was alive with invisible energy, searing and lethal, yet silent, motionless, and deceptively calm. Those who approached it had to contend with the deadly reality that this mass was a force that could kill in moments, yet it had been born from human error, hubris, and flawed design. Over time, measurements revealed its staggering power. Instruments failed, readings skyrocketed, and yet the curiosity and determination of humanity pushed experts to get closer. Their findings would inform containment strategies, safety protocols, and the understanding of nuclear disasters for decades to come. The Elephant's Foot was more than a physical object. It was a symbol of hubris, of human fallibility, and of the raw, uncontrollable power of the atom. Those who studied it knew they were confronting a force far beyond ordinary comprehension, a force that had changed not only the reactor, but the world's understanding of nuclear risk forever. As radiation continued to spread silently through the air, the authorities faced an impossible task: evacuating an entire city without triggering panic. Pripyat, home to nearly 50,000 residents, was still largely unaware of the invisible danger above them. Initially, many dismissed the warnings. Life had always followed a predictable rhythm.
and the idea that an invisible cloud could bring death seemed unfathomable. But by the morning of April 27th, the truth could no longer be ignored. Orders were given. The city must be evacuated immediately. Buses rolled through the streets, collecting families who clutched their belongings, confused, frightened, and unsure of what awaited them. Some residents were told it was only a temporary measure, a few days at most. No one explained the true danger of radiation, its long-term consequences, or the lives that would be forever altered by this decision. The evacuation of Pripyat marked a turning point in the disaster. It was the moment when the human dimension of Chernobyl became painfully real, families uprooted, lives interrupted, and the long shadow of radiation beginning to reach across borders, touching countless lives far beyond the reactor walls. The radioactive cloud from Chernobyl did not stay confined to Ukraine. Carried by winds across borders, it drifted silently over Europe, contaminating towns and farmland far from the reactor itself. At first, the extent of the fallout was unclear. Instruments detected radiation, but governments struggled to understand the scale of the disaster. The Soviet government, desperate to control information, downplayed the event. Official statements assured citizens that everything was under control. Yet scientists monitoring radiation levels knew the truth. A deadly plume was spreading, invisible and relentless, affecting millions. Countries from Scandinavia to Central Europe issued warnings, monitored air, milk, and water, and scrambled to protect their populations. Panic rippled quietly among those who understood the invisible threat, while many remained unaware, living ordinary lives under the shadow of something they could not see. The disaster sparked fear, debate, and international scrutiny. Scientists, journalists, and governments confronted an unprecedented challenge: how to respond to a nuclear event on this scale without triggering mass hysteria. Every measurement, every precaution was a race against an invisible enemy moving faster than anyone could stop. Chernobyl's fallout demonstrated that nuclear disasters do not respect borders. The damage was global, both physically and psychologically. Fear of radiation touched entire continents, raising questions about the safety of nuclear power, the transparency of governments, and the true cost of human error when dealing with forces beyond control. The world had witnessed something terrifying. A single night at a single reactor had changed the perception of nuclear energy forever, and the invisible consequences would be felt for decades to come. As the world grappled with the aftermath of Chernobyl, another layer of the disaster began to emerge: the secrets and controversies that had been buried beneath layers of government control. The classified documents, survivor testimonies, and leaked reports painted a darker picture than what had been publicly acknowledged. The Soviet leadership had initially suppressed the full extent of the disaster. Radiation levels were minimized, the severity of health impacts understated, and the dangers faced by first responders and nearby residents largely concealed. People who tried to warn others often faced ridicule, dismissal, or worse. Even decades later, mysteries remain. Some claim that entire sections of the reactor were improperly documented, that dangerous experiments had been conducted in secret, and that crucial decisions were made to protect the reputation of the state rather than the lives of its citizens. Survivors' accounts reveal harrowing details: hazmat suits that were inadequate, measurements ignored, and exposure far beyond what anyone had anticipated. Engineers, firefighters, and scientists risked death, often without proper information, training, or protective equipment. The controversies surrounding Chernobyl go beyond the technical. They raise uncomfortable questions about human hubris, accountability, and the cost of secrecy in the face of unprecedented danger. The disaster was not only a failure of technology, but also a failure of transparency, trust, and the systems that were meant to protect people. Chernobyl remains a cautionary tale, a reminder that the truth can be as dangerous as the disaster itself, and that some secrets, once hidden, can haunt generations long after the flames have died down. Decades have passed since the explosion at Chernobyl, but its legacy remains vivid and haunting. The reactor's ruins stand as a stark reminder of what can happen when technology, human error, and secrecy collide. The exclusion zone stretches for miles, a silent testament to the scale of the disaster and the lives it affected. The health impacts continue to ripple through generations. Thyroid cancers, radiation sickness, and psychological trauma are only part of the story. Families were uprooted, communities destroyed, and memories of normal life forever erased. For some, the past is an invisible burden, lingering long after the initial catastrophe. Yet from tragedy comes knowledge. Engineers, scientists, and policymakers learned lessons that reshaped nuclear safety worldwide. Protocols were rewritten, reactors redesigned, and global monitoring of nuclear power became more rigorous. Humanity's understanding of radiation, containment, and disaster management expanded, saving countless lives in the decades since. Chernobyl also stands as a cautionary tale. It warns of the limits of human control, the consequences of arrogance, and the dangers of prioritizing secrecy over safety. The elephant's foot, the abandoned city, and the stories of bravery and sacrifice all remind us that some disasters cannot be undone, only remembered and studied. Today, Chernobyl has a dual identity, a symbol of devastation and a source of scientific insight. Wildlife has returned, forests have reclaimed the land, and researchers cautiously study the reactor and its effects. But the lessons remain clear. Vigilance, transparency, and respect for the power we wield are essential. The night the world almost ended was not just a historical event. It was a stark reminder that human choices have consequences beyond imagination. And as we study, explore, and understand, we honor the lives affected and ensure that the horrors of Chernobyl are never forgotten. If you enjoyed this video and are still not subscribed, please consider it, as it really helps me out a lot. Thank you.